what we are going to do during this 20 marker is try and break it down so that we're able to access all of the AO1, AO2 and AO3 points so that we can try, where possible, to get the full 20 marks. This question is a good example actually, because what it does is it automatically, if I just show you here, is it automatically breaks the question down into the sections that we want. So if we went through our normal setup and we talked about doing the bucket function, you can see that when we box our command word, it tells us here, first part, we're going to define the term flexibility, and we'll do that in just a second. Then if we look at the next one, using examples, we've got this second command word here. We've got to explain the factors that can affect the flexibility of a performer in sport. And then finally, again, setting up our structure, we've then got to critically evaluate the types of training. Okay, so if I just change colour up the top here, when we talk about the bugging it function, all right, we're going to box our command words, which we've done. Okay, we're then going to underline any of the key words that we think this is going to be talking about. So here we can see that we have to define the term flexibility. Okay, using examples, explain factors, and this is the key bit here, affect. Oh, helps if I can underline properly, but affect the flexibility of a performer in sport. And then the final part is critically evaluate different types of training. Okay, so it's not just different types of training in terms of strength development or plyometrics or anything like that. It's specifically to develop flexibility. Okay, so what we're going to work on as we go through is breaking this down into those 3 different sections. Okay, and I'm going to try and type it as we go so that hopefully you should be able to follow. All right, so let's start with this definition of flexibility. Okay, helps if I can type, but there we go. Anyone that's used to lessons with me, you'll be used to my lack of spelling. There you go. Okay, so definition of flexibility. All right, so what do we know about it? All right, so we can say that the first part actually is pretty simple. We know that flexibility is the range of movement, all right, which I'm going to shorten to range of movements around a joint. Now, in particular with this, actually, it's not just at a single joint. It could be in a series of joints. If you think about how complex the joints of the human body are, actually we could say that not just one joint is going to provide the flexibility, but it's actually going to be a series of joints working together in order to do that. Okay, so we've defined it. Now that's very basic knowledge. That's something you would pick up from a GCSE section that we would talk about. But what we need to think about in terms of our A level is the 2 different types of flexibility that we have. All right, so we have something called dynamic flexibility, and we have something that is called static flexibility. Okay, so in terms of our studies, when we talk about dynamic flexibility, we have to think about taking into account this concept of speed. Okay, so speed of movement. All right, so when we're talking about dynamic flexibility, we're talking about taking into account this speed of movement. So if we think of any gymnastics action, a straddle jump, for example, all right, that's a good example of a dynamic flexibility move. If I think of my straddle jump, I can probably get about 20 centimeters apart. But if we think of a gymnast in that straddle jump position, it's very, very dynamic. Okay, I'm sure you can come up with plenty of examples in your own sport. But then if we think about static flexibility, okay, we're talking about the range of movement around a joint, but not taking into account speed or movement. All right, so we're not taking into account that speed of movement. Okay, in order for the static flexibility, there has to be some sort of external force applied. All right, so we need to take that. So any static strength that we can think about, any of those sort of exercises that you did at the start of a PE lesson where you bend down, touch your toes, anything like that, any static stretch is coming under this static type of flexibility. Think of somebody holding the splits. Okay, what we need to also think about is actually we need to have static strength, static flexibility. we need to have that before dynamic flexibility. All right, so we need to have this static flexibility before we can develop dynamic flexibility, okay? Because without that, we are likely to sustain injuries. Okay, so when we talk about our training, we're going to talk about developing static flexibility in that range of movement around the joint, and then move on to how can that help with the dynamic flexibility that we will have. Okay, so that gains us our first part of this. All right, we've defined the term flexibility. We have, let me just move this down slightly. We have broken it down into the dynamic and the static. So we're not just talking about one, so we're able to access the full marks on this section. All right, so second part, we need to explain. Okay, there are many factors that will affect the flexibility of a performer in sport, many of them. Okay. We'll start off with some of the basic ones. So we've got a joint type. If you think back to your GCSE work that you used to do way back in the day, last year, or even if you haven't finished your GCSEs because of the coronavirus, okay, stuff that you've done over the last few months. So the joint type, we know that we've got hinge joints, we've got ball and socket joints, we've got all of these condyloid, all of these different types of joints within our body. But if you consider your shoulder joint, okay, your shoulder joint is the most mobile and it's notoriously the most easily injured because it has a wide range of motion. Okay, it covers many planes, and if you compare that to a hinge joint where you've just got flexion and extension, in a ball and socket joint, all right, so if I put here ball and socket joint, we've got a wide range of movement across rotation, circumduction, flexion, extension, horizontal flexion, horizontal extension. You've got hyperextension. We've got all sorts of movements that are going on within that shoulder joint. And in comparison to a hinge joint, it becomes much more flexible. Okay, so our joint type is a really big factor in explaining the flexibility of a performer. All right. So if we move on to the next one, staying with the actual joint structure itself, the joint shape, okay, will also have a factor. Now let's stay with the ball and socket joint in the shoulder. All right, so stay with that shoulder. It's got a very shallow socket. Okay, so if you think about where the glenoid fossa on the scapula is located, actually it's a very shallow socket. Okay, and that actually allows a greater range of motion in comparison, okay, in comparison to the hip joint. Okay, so in the hip joint, you have something called the acetabulum. My pronunciation is always terrible. And that's where the head of the femur sits inside, okay? And that's where that socket is. It's much deeper than that of the shoulder joint. And if you consider your hip joint is far less mobile than your shoulder joint. While you sat here at home working on this, wiggle your shoulder around, wiggle your hip around, you'll notice that there are limitations on that hip joint movement. Okay, so we have to think about that as well in terms of that joint shape. Okay, if we consider our next area that's going to another factor, okay, so we're explaining this as we're going along, we have all of the bits that connect our joints together. Okay, and if we have very flexible joints, you hear about people talking about their elasticity of their joint, the elasticity of the connective tissues. Some people have they have medical changes to that elasticity. If you're interested, look up something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is you basically become hypermobile, where that connective tissue is incredibly mobile, which makes the joints very unstable. But in this instance, if we were to explain the factors that affect flexibility, we need to think about the tendons, the ligaments. Okay, I'm just going to type these on here for you. The tendons, the ligaments, even when we look at structure of the actual muscle itself, you've got the epimysium. I don't know if I can spell this. Mysium. You have got the endo and the peri. Okay, when you do this stuff with Mr. Aitken, you'll understand a little bit more about the actual structure of that within the anatomy and physiology. But essentially, it's talking about the physical flexibility of that actual connective tissue around the outside of the muscle or around the muscle fibers. All right. Moving on from that, you've actually got the elasticity of the muscle itself. Okay. That's again linked to something called our stretch reflex mechanism, where the muscle spindles within the muscle and where that kicks in before the stretch reflex response. So at what point does that pain kick in or the muscle go under tension whilst you're trying to stretch it? Okay. Like we mentioned previously, we have to think of the strength of opposing muscles. If you think back to your GCSEs, we know that our muscles work in antagonistic pairs. So in order for one muscle to work, the other has to relax. And that's the same to be said for flexibility. You know, we have to be able to contract one muscle in order to get a stretch from the other muscles. All right, if you think about holding a static stretch, you can contract your quadricep muscles, which will form automatically a stretch of your hamstring muscles. If you sit there right now at the table and you contract your quadriceps, you should be able to feel that stretch within the hamstrings as well. All right, but if you don't have that strength of the opposing muscles, then you're not going to be able to get as much range of motion or the different levels of flexibility. Okay. Next factor that we have to consider is the muscle or fat. Perhaps if I can type, fat masses. All right. Think about those pictures of very, very, very muscular bodybuilders. All right. You see them with their huge, great big latissimus dorsi muscles, which actually stop their arms being able to go next to their side. But if we think about any bulk around the joint, whether that is fat mass, okay, or muscle mass, that's actually going to impact that range of motion around that joint. Okay. Other factors that you might put into this is temperature. All right. Warm up is key. And the warmer our muscles are, the more flexible that they become, including the connective tissues around it. Age, naturally, our bodies create less collagen as we get older, and that causes a hardening of the connective tissues. Okay, so as you age, you get a decrease in flexibility. Okay, or range of motion, however you want to word this. And then finally, you've got training. Okay, so the type of training that you do, the type of stretching that you do as part of your program can increase your range of motion. But also, generally speaking, those people, those performers, those athletes who are physically fitter tend to actually also have a greater range of movement around their joints. All right, but as long as that training is balanced and that training is appropriate for what they're trying to do. You know, if you think about people overdeveloping their pectoral muscles, they may suffer with an imbalance in the muscles in their shoulder and their back. So it's important to balance everything out as much as possible. Okay, so just to summarize where we are with that, what we've managed to do here is answer our first two parts of the question. We've defined flexibility just across here, and then we've used these examples: joint type, joint shape, elasticity, elasticity of the muscles, strength of the muscles, muscle fat, temperature, age, and the training. What we've done there is we've used examples to explain the factors that can affect the flexibility of a performer. All right, so the final part, to gain these elusive 20 mark points, okay, we have to critically evaluate the different types of training. Okay, and remember, we're talking about flexibility. So in all honesty, within this, I don't really want to hear about all of your training that you're going to do to build up your strength. All right, I want this purely to talk about developing flexibility. Okay, so we have different types, and we're going to look at 4 types of training within this section. Okay, so the first one is static stretching. Okay, if you think about static stretching, you have to consider you can have active stretching or you can have passive stretching. Active stretching, is where the athlete is unassisted. Okay, it's unassisted in holding those stretches. You would personally move the joint to its stretch position with no external forces. Okay, so you're purely using your own body in order to achieve that stretch. All right. If we think of a positive of this, it's safe, it's simple. All right, really, really easy for people to do. It is effective, effective at increasing range of movement around that joint. And it's also really good for aiding relaxation at the end. Okay, at the end of your training, it's a really, really good way of aiding that muscle relaxation to help with recovery, but also to maintain that muscle length after you have trained. All right, you'll notice that actually it's best at the end of a session. Okay, so static stretching at the beginning of those sessions, perhaps not as useful as they would be as at the end of a session. Couple of negatives, because remember we're critically evaluating, is the slowest method. All right, it's one of the slowest methods of actually developing that. But it also, if we think about if we did it before, it's actually failing to prepare muscles, still can't type, for dynamic movements. So if you consider doing static stretching before you go off and play a game of football, actually it's not helping that body and that muscle develop prior to an activity that range of movement that's needed for dynamic movement. Okay. However, you can use it as maintenance. Okay, so to maintain flexibility and develop. Okay, but that again, that primarily that development happens at the end of it. Okay. Thinking back to up here when we talked about static stretching, we talked about active and passive. So passive stretching and passive flexibility training is essentially involving external forces. Okay, so those external forces could be a partner, it could be some equipment, it could be using a wall, it could be absolutely anything that helps to increase the amount of force that's applied. Okay, so it's a little bit more intense than static stretching, the active side of it, but it is still safe, it's still simple, it's still also very good for aiding relaxation at the end of a session. Okay, but again, it's still slow and still fails to prepare for our actual dynamic movements. I'm going to just quickly switch, if I can, to a different color, just so we look at our second type of training. That's clearly not worked, but we'll shimmy down here anyway. So next one, ballistic. Let me come off that. Ballistic training. Now, ballistic to me, in that very word, actually sounds dangerous. I don't know if you agree with that, but it sounds dangerous to me, because what we're doing here is we're using momentum. All right, so we're using momentum and we're actually going to extreme range of motion. So we've got an extreme range of motion. Now, that to me sounds dangerous. Okay, there's lots of swinging movements, there's lots of circling movements, but we're using momentum and we're gaining momentum in order to get a more extreme range of motion. However, all right, it's useful. It can improve speed. I still can't spell. Improve speed and power. There we go. So it's going to improve our speed and power. It's better suited to ballistic dynamic activities. So if you think about people who do martial arts, if you think about people who do judo throws, anything where you've got quite a ballistic movement, quite an explosive movement, then actually this type of training is very good to develop that. If we think about this also, we actually don't gain that much in terms of muscle length. So there's a limited increase in muscle length. We don't gain that much from it in that sense. There is a high chance of injury. All right, don't do this correctly. Don't do this when you're warm. You are likely to get yourself injured in doing it. Okay. You also limit the impact of the stretch reflex mechanism to adapt to that strength, but you'll look at that a little bit more in anatomy and physiology. But this is good. This is good for people who are already flexible. All right, so if you've already got a good range of movement around the joint, then this is going to be good for them. Okay, so it's actually quite helpful for those types of athlete. Okay, third type of training is dynamic training. All right, this is takes consideration of movement and takes the joint through full range of movement, but it is controlled. So if we think of the difference between ballistic and we think of the comparison between dynamic and ballistic, actually in this instance we are controlled. So it's not extreme range of motion. Okay, it's very controlled at the very end of that movement. Okay, positives, less risk of injury. Okay, so less risk of injury with it. You can do this active or passive. So you can do it on your own or you can do it with a partner. And it does improve speed and power. So naturally, you would probably put this at the beginning of a session because it can actually help to improve your dynamic flexibility and that speed and power, say, that you need for a football game or a rugby game or something like that. Okay, it doesn't aid relaxation. Okay, so it's not actually aiding relaxation, so not good at the end of a session. Okay, and again, it is more suited to the already flexible. Okay, it's very badly worded, but it's more suited to those that are already flexible. All right, best used as a warm-up. Okay, the final type of training, PNF, probably my favorite. Okay, this is proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Okay, it's a great term to use. PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Okay, this involves partner work. Okay, so you need somebody in order to do this for you. So that partner will safely, so you don't do it dynamically, but it safely takes to the joint to the point of resistance. In fact, actually just past it. So you will feel a little bit of pain, okay, but not a lot. And it's important to work with your partner in this so that that pain is not overbearing. All right. In this state, so when you're holding that, you hold an isometric contraction against that resistance. So you would almost push back against that resistance being applied for a minimum of 6 to 10 seconds. Okay, so you contract your muscles isometrically against that resistance for 6 to 10 seconds or more. And then as you relax, your partner actually then finds the new stretch position. Okay, so then you stretch again, and what you'll find instantly within that is that as that muscle relaxes and then is stretched again, you get an instant increase in range of motion. Okay, I will put some links to some videos on this because actually it's really quite interesting to do. What this does to our bodies is it inhibits the stretch reflex. Okay, stretch reflex mechanisms are really important in our body. They're part of the proprioception that we use. It's very important to protect joints. Okay, but when we're talking about developing our flexibility, what we actually want to do is inhibit that stretch reflex mechanism. Okay, and what you'll do is you'll gain actually an increased range of movement straight after that first isometric contraction. Again, so this is quick gains. Everyone likes quick gains, easy wins. So it gives our quick gains, and it does aid relaxation. All right, so it aids relaxation, good at the end of a session, but also good between sessions. You know, you could actually use this training on your rest days in order to help to develop your flexibility. So you don't necessarily have to do these always at the beginning and end of a session. You could have this as a specific training regime that you would follow on one of your rest days. Okay, negatives, you need a partner. Okay, requires a partner. So it's not something you can easily do by yourself. You need to have someone with you. And actually it's a complex technique. All right, so it needs to be put together and done safely, because there is obviously a risk of injury in that. So it is a complex technique, and I would say here, training needs to be done to do it safely. All right, I'd rather somebody professional helped me with this as opposed to a friend or a training partner. I'd rather somebody knew what they were doing. Okay, but this is good for both maintaining flexibility and developing flexibility, so you can use it for both. And again, it's good at the end of a session. Okay, so if I just whiz back to the top, you have this all on your work that we are doing. Okay, so what we've done here is we've started to critically evaluate the different types of training. So remember, there were four types of training that we were going to look at. Static stretching, okay, so that's where it's active and passive. Okay, ballistic training, which to me just sounds terrifying and dangerous, and actually, unless you're very flexible already, I'd say it probably was dangerous. The third type is dynamic training, like ballistic but safer. And then finally the PNF, the proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. Okay, so remember, really important to link this back to the question. So if we think about our bug it section, I'm just going to write this here. Okay, bug it. All right, we've boxed our command words. Okay, so we've got define, explain, and critically evaluate. We've underlined the key things that we're talking to, and then the G, this G here actually stands for glancing back, because we can talk all we want about all of these key things that we're doing, but if we don't link back and we don't glance back to the question, we can find ourselves going off on a tangent. All right, so critically evaluate different types of training used to develop flexibility. Remember to include positives and negatives, and then actually make a summary statement after each of them as well. That'll definitely help you to gain those 20 marks there. All right, have a go at answering it. Submit that to me, and we will see where we go from there. All right, good luck.